Just before midnight on August 2000, 35-year-old George knocked on the front door of an apartment in the town of Oregon. As George waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and George saw right in front of him a very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Katrina, and she was 36 years old. By day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven, of which George was a part. Without saying anything, Katrina motioned for George to follow her into her apartment. Then, Katrina turned and began walking away. Before stepping over the threshold, George paused for a moment and turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall muscular man named William. George nodded at William, and William nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As George and William followed Katrina into her apartment, George still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago. So witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. George had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies. So he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. George knew William, the guy he had brought along, was a very powerful warlock, which is a male witch. So he figured, if William's here, this is bound to go to plan. George just hoped he'd be able to keep up with William or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Eventually, Katrina led George and William down a dark hallway to the small living room, where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. As soon as George and William stepped into the room with Katrina, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room. Also, there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Katrina had been burning. In preparation for tonight's event, George, William, and Katrina walked quietly into the middle of the circle of candles. They sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Oregon was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is a town that literally has more cornfields than people. But beneath the calm exterior, Oregon had a dark side amongst the population. Among the residents of Oregon were several very dark witches, but not Katrina, George, and William. They were the good guys. The dark witches were kind of out and about in this town, doing bad things like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. So this coven, led by Katrina, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. Tonight, George, William, and Katrina are going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse, and this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Oregon, a 16-year-old girl named Lisa. As George sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, right between them and William. As he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle, it said Lisa, and on the other candle, it was etched baby because it would turn out this very evil dark witch Lisa was pregnant. So instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two because Lisa and her baby are kind of intertwined. Before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lisa had cast, and the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Katrina because Katrina was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love. And so of course, that had to be a product of this curse. As the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread from Katrina to other witches in this coven, who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. So that was why on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex. That's why George had gone out and brought in William, the experienced warlock from the city of Salem, who claimed he had broken a hex before, and he could do it again for them. As George, Katrina, and William all sat in the circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison, to bring out the dead to join them in the living room right now. and as they began this chant, George found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lisa and baby on them. As he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, George started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. And he knew that based on his prior teachings from Katrina, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. Then, as George is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Katrina begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was a slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over, and she would tell George and William that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught George by surprise. She said again, in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on George and his entire family. And if they didn't break this hex immediately, George and his family would all perish. When George heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones. So this was a really big deal. They needed to end this axe tonight. George listened intently as Katrina began to say in the strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, George and William were going to perform a sacred ritual. Katrina, yes, she began to say to the spirits in the room that George and William, they were ready, that they needed help. So after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did George and William. They were all just sitting there, kind of waiting for something to happen. Then after about a minute of total silence, Katrina began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice. But George and William knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now, Katrina was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex, Arena, she would say in this voice. After saying this, Katrina opened her eyes, and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she got her bearings. She looked at William and George and told them, now in her normal voice, that they had to perform the sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lisa and baby etched on them burned out. So basically, George and William needed to get this done tonight. Katrina handed William a sacred tool that would be used that night in the sacred ritual that William and George were going to complete. Then George and William stood up to leave, and before they left, Katrina would give them the typical witch send-off, which was a lesson. George and William nodded their heads. They turned and walked out of the apartment. As soon as they were out into the night, George could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place. He knew right then and there that he and William would be safe that night because clearly, the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Katrina had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. Feeling very safe and empowered, George and William went straight into George's car, turned it on, pulled away from the curb, and began heading towards their destination. A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch Lisa lived, a 20-year-old army private named Noah was sitting at the kitchen table in Lisa's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Noah didn't know Lisa very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lisa, he was at her house to see his own mother. Noah and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, so Noah's dad had raised him. When Noah was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war. Unexpectedly, Noah's father had died, so Noah had come back to Oregon for the funeral. It was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well. Even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, you know what, I want to reconnect with her. So he'd gone over and had given her a hug. His mother had been so touched that she had asked Noah to come by her house in Oregon, where she lived with her boyfriend because she really wanted some alone time to actually hear about Noah's life and kind of, you know, get back together again. So of course, Noah had said yes, and here he was at this house in Oregon. Now, Noah had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Leo, was also living there, along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch Lisa. But Noah didn't really mind that there were extra people. It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation. But it seemed like Leo and his girlfriend, Lisa, were very nice people. They quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Noah and his mother could catch up. So after Noah finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen, and the two of them chatted for hours. Finally, at about midnight that night, Noah decided to go to bed. He said goodnight to his mom, returned to the bedroom, and laid in bed. But he couldn't really sleep right away because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago, and then at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq to a war zone. He felt ready for that, but at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive. With all these intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. Eventually, Noah did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming from the kitchen. Leo's dog was going crazy. So Noah grabbed his phone, checked the time, and saw it was 3 in the morning. Instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, you know what, it's going to stop eventually. Noah grabbed his pillow, put it over his head, and tried to muffle the sounds so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work, the dog just kept on barking. When Noah took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." After Noah heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mom. Acting on instinct, Noah leaped from his bed, ran out of the room, and went into the kitchen. He saw the dog jumping and barking and going mad, his mom screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, grappling with her, wearing black gloves and a face mask. There's another guy next to him with the same getup. It's absolute chaos. But before Noah could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire. Then he went blind, his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, stumbling backward, barely able to stand. Minutes later, George, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lisa's house where all this chaos was happening. He just took off running across the street, directly into a cornfield. As he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. George ran until he couldn't run any farther, then collapsed onto the ground. He began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been. Inside the evil witch's house, not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lisa, but also George was concerned that William, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. George began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world would be nearby and know what to do. But George looked around, and there was no one. So George thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lisa's hex must be stronger than any of us realize. We have to do something. Now we have to end this before me and my family get killed. George pulled out his phone and called Katrina, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But she really didn't respond to what George was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. Then, before he could figure out what was going on with Katrina, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. Over the next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside Katrina's coven, as well as everyone who knew both Katrina and Lisa. Slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside Lisa the evil witch's house in the early morning hours of August 20th, 2000. At about 3 a.m. on August 20th, 2000, George and William pulled up onto Lisa's street and parked their car a little ways away from Lisa's house. Then, after parking, George and William donned their face masks and gloves. After looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lisa's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lisa's windows and confront Lisa the evil witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. After this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lisa's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that had been sent along by Katrina from the spirit world. Now George and William felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lisa's house and William actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart. First, the dog began to bark inside Lisa's house, alerting Noah's mother, who rushed into the kitchen. There, she saw the dog and witnessed William falling through the window. George, who was unaware of what was happening inside the house, climbed to the window after William. Upon entering the kitchen, he realized it was too late, they were caught. Not knowing what to do, George observed the chaos unfolding. He glanced at William, who retrieved something from his belt, a tool given by Katrina when they left her apartment to carry out a sacred ritual. This tool, a long sharp knife, was essential for their plan, to stab the evil witch Lisa to break the hex. After killing Lisa, they intended to perform a strange ritual with her clothing to send her soul to Hell's Gates. George understood the plan, but perhaps he underestimated William's seriousness or his violent nature. William, not merely a warlock but a criminal who had bragged to Katrina about previous murders related to hexes, was determined to carry out the plan. Moreover, George might not have been aware that Katrina instructed William to eliminate any obstacles hindering the hex-breaking ritual on Lisa. As George watched, William raised the knife and repeatedly stabbed Noah's mother in the chest, screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." At that moment, Noah, an army private, charged into the kitchen in his underwear upon hearing the commotion. George witnessed William shift from stabbing Noah's mother to stabbing Noah directly in the chest. And George, at this point, jumped right in. He pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Noah in the eyes, causing him to feel the burning sensation, go blind, and struggle to breathe before falling to the ground. Inside the kitchen, chaos reigned. The actual target of William and George, Lisa, the evil witch, managed to flee the house and sought help from a nearby neighbor. Meanwhile, Leo, the evil witch's boyfriend, came upstairs carrying a shotgun. Noah lay on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest, while his mother struggled nearby. William was completely oblivious to the bizarre events unfolding around him, swinging his knife erratically. Meanwhile, George was in a state of panic, unsure of what to do. When Leo charged in with the shotgun, George attempted to stab him with his own knife but ended up missing and stabbing himself in the leg instead. Hence, his throbbing and bleeding leg was a result of his own misjudgment. After George accidentally stabbed himself, Leo kicked him down the stairs into the basement. Then Leo redirected his attention from George to William, who continued to wield the knife frenziedly, displaying utter mania. And Leo just walked over to William, and William he sees the shotgun coming over to him and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then somehow only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Leo just fired a slug directly into William's gut. And it was at this moment, as William is crumbling to the ground with his horrible stomach wound, that the neighbor that Lisa the evil witch had gone to go get and come to the house, they went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. Before the neighbor could react, George, who had accidentally stabbed himself in the leg, was kicked down into the basement. He scrambled up the steps and bolted past the bodies strewn on the ground, ignoring the neighbor's bewildered presence, and dashed into the cornfield. The neighbor, taken aback, didn't attempt to decipher the chaos but promptly dialed 911. However, it was too late for Noah, the army private who had come to this house to reconcile with his estranged mother before his deployment to Iraq. He lay lifeless on the ground, a victim of the inexplicable assault. Little did anyone know, George, William, and the entire coven of witches led by Katrina had fallen victim to a cunning deception. They all fully believed that Lisa was, in fact, an evil witch who had cast this hex on Katrina, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Katrina, the leader of this coven, didn't believe there was a hex that had nothing to do with any of this. The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lisa was dating Leo. Katrina had previously dated Leo, and they had broken up. Katrina still wanted to get back together, but Leo didn't. And so now that Leo was with Lisa, Katrina just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Katrina had constructed this whole thing about Lisa being one of the dark witches in Oregon, and she had cast this hex, which Lisa did not end up getting killed. Instead, it was the totally innocent person, Noah, the army private who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Noah dying, William, the warlock from the city of Salem, died from the shotgun blast to his stomach, and then Noah's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by William, actually survived her attack. Katrina would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. George pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years. A third member of the coven who was not present for the attack but who, after the fact, helped cover it up, was sentenced to 32 years in prison.